Hello and welcome. His portraits include the glitterati from the worlds of fashion, film and music, including the Rolling Stones, Judy Garland and the Beatles. He even went on to marry Hollywood star Faye Dunaway, but at heart remains true to his craft of catching the world on film at opportune moments. This week on 101, meet the legendary photographer, Terry ONeill. It was his ability to portray his subjects in an unconventional way that built the reputation of this celebrity photographer, whether they were actors, musicians or politicians. From the early days working as a Fleet Street newspaper photographer, Terry ONeill quickly grew to be the name the famous wanted, wielding the lens for their portraits. That included the legendary Frank Sinatra, who ONeill says let him see a private side few got to glimpse, revealed somewhat in his book Sinatra, Frank and Friendly, released by ONeill in 2007. The photographer's long-time relationship and eventual marriage to actress Faye Dunaway turned out to be a rocky one, with them arguing publicly over whether or not their boy Liam was his biological son. In his 2003 collection of portraits under the clear and simple title Celebrity, Terry ONeill reveals candidly with his lens why he himself was as much a name as many of the people he photographed. Terry, it's great to have a chance to chat with you.
Hi.
Now, I read you were saying that you still feel embarrassed about being a photographer. Considering you average around 500 magazine covers a year, that's quite strange. What's so embarrassing?
Oh, I've never really felt photographer from the time I started. I mean, when we first started, it was like we're going to have to get a proper job when we're 24, 25, because it was the start of the 60s. And, we used to sit with the Beatles and Stones in this club, and we used to make a joke about, can you imagine Mick Jagger singing at 60? And we used to talk about what jobs we were going to do. And I think Ringo wanted to get enough money to buy a hair salon, someone else wanted to work in a bank. So we thought, we'd have to get a proper job one day. And I've never really felt, it's always been a hobby come work to me. I've never looked on it as a job.
Now, in the 60s, you were saying how photographers were higher up the pecking order than rock bands even, and pop stars. What was it that made photographers so important?
Well, we were the ones who photographed the people coming through, and it was becoming a visual aid. At the time, I did the first picture of the Beatles that was in a national newspaper, and to open up a newspaper and find a picture of a pop group was unheard of. But the paper sold out that day, and then that's what I was sort of on a new road photographing all these new people. And
it was an art. And we'll get into it a bit more in a moment about the way you crafted the art, but you're not a big fan of digital photography, are you?
No, not at all. Anyone can take a picture with that. And if they can't, they can straighten it out with all these little gimmicks and things like that. But it's going to be the death of photography, actually. Except there are people who use it who are sort of more than photographers. They're photographers, come art directors, come picture editors, who can take it to another level, but it won't be your basic photograph.
What about your work as a newspaper photographer? At the time you were doing that sort of the snapshots for the papers, how do you regard the paparazzi?
Well, the paparazzi should be shot, actually. They've brought photography down to a joke. As you see, every magazine today, or every world magazine is paparazzi driven. I don't know why the country's rulers don't make a rule to ban all these photographers, because they've just killed any sort of real photojournalism or photography in general.
Well, let's take you back in time. You were born into the East End of London.
Yeah.
Are you technically a Cockney, by the way?
Well, I was a Cockney, but I moved to Heston, a place I believe you know.
Yeah, I grew up, that's
yeah,
right.
So, but I was 2 when I moved there. But,
Right.
I was born in Romford, which is in the East End. And, I'm East End boy.
And it was just in time for World War II to start.
Yeah, it was just before the war.
Yeah, what do you recall of that time?
Well, all I remember was being brought up in an air raid shelter. I was brought up every night, 6 o'clock onwards. We used to go down into this little black hole, about 9 or 10 people, and friends of my mother and father. And we used to spend every night in the blackness. And we used to get up 6:30 to the sound of doodlebugs landing. I mean, it was really hairy. I mean, Heston Airport was at the end of the road, as you remember. So, I mean, that was one of the targets because Churchill used to fly out from there and, you know, they were determined to bomb the hell out of this airport. So it was not very, you know, my father took me up and I saw these flying bombs going over. I mean, if once there was no sound, that's when you knew you were in trouble.
You left school at 14 and you went on to, I mean, your aspirations were to be a jazz drummer,
Yeah.
jazz musician, even to travel across to America.
Yes. Well, when I left school, I played in clubs mostly for American Air Force men. You know, we used to play in the rice slip at the base there twice a week, and they had great musicians. And I wanted to, then once I went into the army and I came out and I wanted to go to America, so I tried to get a job at British, well, BOAC as it was then, as an air steward, because you flew to New York one day and stayed there 3 days and then came back for 3 days. And I thought that was a great way to you know, drum in both towns.
But they only had a job for you in the sort of photographic unit or something.
Yes. And then, that's right, they had a job in the photographic unit, so I took that. And suddenly I got, I mean, it was forced on me, but I was forced to become a photographer.
Your father was from Cork originally, and your mother, I think, was from Waterford. Is that right?
Yes.
Now you had, in terms of the influence, you were saying to me at one point that your mother let you leave school, though you were very, very good at school.
Yes.
How did they regard your ambitions to be a drummer?
Well, I mean, I don't, do you know, it's all a blur to me. I just don't know. My father and I didn't really ever get on, so he didn't really care what I did. But I know it really hurt my mother. But, you know, because then I disappeared and I'd be away for 3 days playing somewhere or something like that. Didn't really go down well. And I sort of drifted away from my parents, unfortunately.
How did you end up training to be a priest for a while?
Oh, that was partly because my best friend at school was a brilliant student, and he wanted to become a priest, and my mother and his mother were friends, so you know, I was very shy at the time, so I just got lulled into it.
Now tell me about the time you were freelancing at London Airport. You got the job as a photographer and you were given the sort of free rein to go and snap away there. You took that scoop, your first scoop of the Conservative politician in Harold Macmillan's government, R.A.B. Butler, sleeping.
Yes, I mean, what happened was where we used to get homework, we had to go to art school once a week, and they gave us homework, and I had to go down. They sent me down to London Airport to photograph reportage, you know, people saying goodbye and crying and everything, you know, and all that type of thing. And there was suddenly this bloke one day in a pinstripe suit surrounded by African chieftains, and he'd fallen asleep, and it just made a fantastic picture. Anyway, I took the picture, and next thing I know, a guy comes up to me, says, "I'm a reporter from the Sunday Dispatch, and I'd like my editor to see your picture." So I gave him the film. Then I had to ring up the editor at 5 o'clock that night, and he said, "I really like the pictures on your roll of film, and I'd like you to cover the airport." Well, this was, you know, I was a kid, you know what I mean? It was like unbelievable. Anyway, I used to get 25 quid for doing that every Saturday. And I had a cheap little camera, but it was amazing. I mean, that's why, you know, when you asked me in the beginning about, it was never real to me. You know what I mean? It was everything, I fell into everything.
But you became the youngest photographer on Fleet Street. At 21, you were pretty much the youngest guy on the
I was, by 10 years. All the rest of the guys were 31 and onwards. And I mean, when I look back what I did, I've only just thought of it recently because I've got that age myself. So they must have thought, this kid, what had he, you know, I mean, I was looked on as the picture editor's favourite. And I used to get so much space every day. Like I used to do 3 or 4 or 5 jobs a day. It was incredible.
Was it a particularly competitive time as a photographer?
Yeah, it was very competitive. The competition between newspapers was incredible. And of course, I became the new young gun. So, you know, I mean, I didn't realise at the time, but I mean, you know, I must have been really envied by the older guys.
What was the transition then? At what point did you really start to go away from the news side of things into more sort of the portraits and glamour, I guess?
Well, I mean, what actually happened was I wanted to follow up stories, you know. I mean, I used to get emotionally involved with news stories that we were covering. And I used to say, well, why don't we go and follow up this bloke who was thrown out of whatever it was and something. The picture editor pointed to this spike, and it had all yesterday's pictures on it, you know, like before they cleared it all up. And he said, that's yesterday's news. He said, you have to go out and do today's news. So anyway, this went on for a good couple of years, and I suddenly, I mean, I got sent to cover a plane crash in Stavanger in Oslo where a load of children died, and I got sent to cover the funeral on the following Wednesday, and I found that I couldn't take a picture. I mean, it was having seen the bodies and then seeing the funeral, and I just went back and I said to the picture editor, sorry, I can't do it anymore. Then he sent me into the editor, and the editor said, once you leave this newspaper, you're going to be finished. This newspaper's made you, and if the day you leave, you'll be nothing. Of course, I was shaking inside because this really shocked me. But then I went out and I just rang up everybody I knew, because I'd got to know quite a few people by then, and just said, can I photograph you, like Peter Sellers, the actor, and all this type of thing. And I got through the first couple of weeks and I never ever looked back.
And were you, I mean, at that time, were you starting to think about how you were crafting, rather than taking pictures to capture what was something newsy? You obviously then had to, as you say, sort of set a scene. You describe photography a bit like directing films. You have to set a scene. So at what point did you start to realise you were setting a scene?
Well, once I got on my own, you know, in a newspaper job, you just take a few pictures of what happens, but for the world I wanted to work in, you had to do picture stories, you know, build like a story, like a film script. And one thing I realised, that the photographer has to be like a director, you know, because, you know, these people don't come along and just do everything. You have to direct them the way you see it. I just had a good way with me with that, so I was lucky.
Well, Terry, I want to talk about some of those amazing pictures you've taken in just a moment. We're going to take a short break here. We're back with more One-on-One in just a moment.